A strut bar, sometimes called a strut tower brace, is a structural component that attaches the top of one strut assembly to the other. More generically, there are areas inside the car near the wheel wells that are pretty rigid on their own, but can be made more rigid with the help of this part, allowing the suspension system to play a more direct role in the way the wheels move up and down. A strut tower brace is not a sway bar or anti-roll bar. An anti-roll bar connects the moving suspension parts of left and right pairs of wheels together, typically near the bottom of the vehicle, while a strut brace connects the left and right sides of the frame together, which moves so little you shouldn't notice it. For a lot of vehicles, a strut bar is an additional aftermarket part that can be added to improve handling. But some vehicles leave the factory with this part installed, such as this 2005 Pontiac GTO. You will generally find them on sportier vehicles where good handling is vital. I'm sure beginners have a lot of questions, so let's go over a few in order to learn about these parts. Where are strut bars installed in a vehicle? Strut bars are most typically seen in the engine bay, but the back area can also have a strut mount location. However, not all vehicles have mounting points in the back or even up front. These mounts are most common on vehicles with McPherson strut style suspension. A bar may be fastened directly to suspension components like the strut bearing assembly, or it may fasten to the frame via dedicated points. Sometimes both options will be used simultaneously. On a few vehicles, the strut tower brace may even be able to be attached to other points of the frame, such as the firewall, to provide even more rigidity. Can a strut bar be installed on any vehicle? There are many models of vehicles that don't have any mounting points for strut bars, but even then, with a little customization, nearly any vehicle can be fitted with one, but having that custom work be safe and effective is another concern. There are also often new vehicles that are ready for a strut bar, but nobody has developed one to sell yet. Sometimes the part even exists already, but it hasn't been confirmed to fit that particular model year or trim level, so it may just be a matter of time before someone confirms the part fits. Lastly, sometimes an engine bay is cramped enough that there simply isn't any room for a strut bar unless something else is removed or modified. If both strut towers flex, how does connecting one to the other help? In a McPherson strut suspension design, the assembly that moves with the wheel is attached to the vehicle at the bottom by a control arm and at the top by the strut itself. Not only does the strut tower have to deal with the forces that cause the wheel to move upward into the wheel well, but also a considerable amount of sideways forces from cornering. In other words, the strut tower gets pushed in a lot of different directions, especially sideways. Generally, the wheel on the outside of a given turn takes the most force. For example, when taking a fast left turn, the front right wheel pushes the suspension up into the strut tower as well as to the left. Meanwhile, the front left wheel may actually be experiencing less stress as the vehicle leans away from it. That left strut tower isn't doing much, so when a strut tower brace is added, it gets put to work and resists the movement of the right strut tower. On top of that, because struts are typically leaned in towards the middle of the vehicle at their tops, even something as simple as going over a speed bump may flex the two strut towers towards each other. A brace in this scenario will act against that movement and force the wheel assemblies to act on the springs rather than the strut towers. If suspension is designed to move around and keep all the tires on the ground, how does stiffening the vehicle frame improve handling? Also, how is it any different than stiffer springs or bushings? Many forces act on a vehicle in ways that may not transfer to the suspension springs, such as sideways forces from cornering, thrust forces from acceleration and braking, as well as any infinite number of combinations that result from road conditions and driving scenarios coming together. While engineers do account for this with suspension bushing designs, there will always be some body flex. While even this body flex may be considered in the design of other parts, the more parts flex at once, the less likely a wheel is to be positioned in an ideal place and angle. Making the chassis more rigid generally means the forces are affecting the suspension rather than the chassis, so the wheels will move more as the suspension intends for it to move. Stiffening the frame also comes with fewer downsides when compared to stiffening the springs or bushings. Suspension bushings serve multiple roles, playing a vital part in isolating the cabin from noise that comes from tires, brakes, and suspension part movement. While stiffening them also makes the suspension more predictable, it also means that a lot of the jarring movements that would have been taken up by the flex in a softer bushing are now felt in the vehicle, either overall or in the steering. Stiffer springs alter the vehicle's driving dynamics completely, and is at times a matter of personal preference whether it is an improvement or not. The Strut Tower Brace tends to be the stiffening part that forces you to give up the least driving comfort of the three. Be aware, however, that these parts don't just stack, they amplify each other. They also vary in effectiveness from model to model and product to product, so even if you watch reviews of every part for your particular vehicle from the most good faith content creators, combining parts will be real difficult to predict the results of. What does improve is going to be the placement of the wheels relative to the vehicle, which will feel like more responsive steering and a different behavior when dealing with bumps on a quick corner. Just how much you feel is going to depend on the design of the bar itself and how stiff the frame was to begin with. Are there any drawbacks to strut tower braces? A strut bar may alter handling in an undesirable way, such as throwing off the oversteer-understeer balance or the general feel of how the front behaves compared to the rear. This is especially the case when a strut tower brace is only installed on the front or rear instead of both locations. A strut bar may also add just enough rigidity to become uncomfortable for some people. Beyond handling and comfort, a front strut tower brace almost always adds an obstacle to engine bay maintenance and repairs, while a rear strut tower brace may take away storage space, seating, or require the removal of interior trim pieces. Finally, a strut tower bar of any sort does cost money, and you might just not get the desired effect you expected for the money you paid. The trickiest part of the downsides is that many of them you just don't know how bad they will be for you until you give it a try, and it is very difficult to test drive a performance part before buying one. How do strut tower bars affect collision safety? This is a difficult to answer question, but it will certainly alter the outcome of relevant crash locations, such as a side impact into the hood area when a front brace is installed. While the impact itself is altered, if the impact can be avoided entirely thanks to slightly improved responsiveness and handling, someone coming out of that scenario would say that the part made their car safer. It's not something that gets to have a solid, conclusive answer because every combination of car model and strut tower brace brand will have a different result in a given type of collision. Also, even in a mild collision, the brace can potentially add damage where there otherwise wouldn't have been much, if any, by transferring movement along the bar from the damaged strut tower to the other side. However, with the way insurance likes to total out vehicles nowadays, it probably would end up totaled either way. Again, it would be hard to tell what would or wouldn't have happened. Speaking of insurance though, they are always looking for ways to deny a claim, and modifications in general are a favorite nitpick of theirs if they spot one, and strut braces tend to be easy to spot. If the safety aspects of making the frame more rigid are a deal breaker for you, you may want to avoid aftermarket trailer hitches as well. Does a strut tower brace make any other changes more significant? As mentioned in a previous answer, the rigidity provided by a strut tower brace is going to amplify any other suspension modification. However, the most noteworthy pairing is going to be when the strut bar is added with stiffer springs. The springs being more stiff means that they are going to resist compression, and anything that used to flex before is going to be flexing even more. Just imagine the difference between incredibly soft springs and a solid cylinder of metal instead of a spring. The soft springs are going to compress so readily that the frame barely deals with any forces, while on the solid springless design, the frame flex is going to be the only thing available to give way. The stiffer spring is bringing you closer to that no spring scenario, so making the chassis more stiff is going to help it fight back against the push of the wheel and the spring. If these parts really improve the vehicle, why doesn't the manufacturer install them on every car? The added cost of the strut bar likely isn't going to move enough cars off of dealer lots to justify the added cost. There's a common misconception that just because auto manufacturers have some of the largest R&D departments in the automotive industry, that this somehow means that every car leaves the factory the best that it can possibly be. Sure, cars today are incredibly well designed compared to decades ago, but they still have to consider the fact that even brand loyal customers have a budget limit. Longer term, there is also a cost of ownership factor to consider. If the strut tower bar gets in the way of basic maintenance, the amount of time to have a service done goes up, and mechanic hourly rates add up quickly. Plus, as mentioned earlier, some manufacturers do have models that come equipped with them from the factory. Do shock tower braces have any effect on vehicles with double wishbone suspension? They can, but since more of the sideways forces are passing through the wishbones rather than the shock absorber and spring, it's going to be less noticeable. It will also matter even more how rigid the chassis is before the brace is installed, as a strong frame will need less help from a brace, and it will be harder to notice a difference in that scenario. Why are some strut tower braces adjustable? On top of being a brace, a strut brace may also be able to push or pull a little on the strut towers to align the struts. Some vehicles may also be prone to having the strut towers flex into a different position over time, so if the brace was sized for a brand new car only, it may be difficult to fit it on a high mileage vehicle. Just some last important things to note about strut tower braces. Even though they are a brace, they are not to be used as a bandage for a rusting out strut tower. Make sure the suspension fundamentals are working correctly before you try to add the fun sporty parts like these. This video on screen is what YouTube thinks you should watch, but consider checking out the channel and feel free to use the comment section of this video if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.